Hi, everybody. This is Tracy Malone, and today we have got a very special guest. Ryan Kalamaya is a lawyer here in Aspen, Colorado, and he is going to be talking with us about something that you all need to understand. Those of you with a prenup or marital agreement, what do we do when we're going through divorce? How do we fight it? Can we fight it? What if you're getting married again? Should we sign one? What does it protect? All kinds of questions that go through your mind about this little piece of paper that you're holding. You don't know the power that it has, and you don't know like how to fight it in a divorce. We're going to discuss something that happened to me and make sure that it doesn't happen to you. We've got excellent tips. So let's welcome Ryan, who's going to give us all this information about marital agreements, post-nup, prenup, during, all kinds of things to protect you so that you know what to do if this situation happens to you. So let's welcome Ryan. Welcome, Ryan, to the show. I'm so excited that you are here. A lawyer on the stage, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get some great information.
Excited to be here, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I want you to tell people about yourself. And I know you've got a great podcast as well. So I want to make sure that we tell people how to reach that as well. So tell me, you are an amazing lawyer. You are a young lawyer, but you are like trending to be super lawyer. So tell us what's going on and tell us a little bit about who you are.
So, Tracy, I grew up not far from where you are in Longmont, Colorado. And then I thought that I was going to be a professional baseball player. That was my aspiration. I was a really good high school baseball player in Colorado. And then I went to University of Virginia on a scholarship and realized very quickly that I was a pretty mediocre college baseball player. So I ended up coming back home to Colorado for law school and made my way up to the mountains. And I am in Aspen based primarily, but my firm, Kalamaya, of which I am the managing partner, has offices in Denver, Edwards, Boulder, Glenwood Springs, and Aspen. So we are a mountain-based law firm. We do personal injury, criminal defense, and divorce. And I never thought that I would, being a kid growing up in Longmont, end up being a divorce lawyer in Aspen, but such is life. And as you mentioned, I am the co-host of a podcast focused on Colorado family law called Divorce at Altitude.
Yes, and that's how I found you. One of my clients in Aspen went, you got to hear this guy. And here we are. So I am so excited. And again, this guy, ladies and gentlemen, he is a rock star, and just getting all these amazing client reviews and testimonials, and if you listen to his podcast, you're going to know exactly what he knows. So today we are here to talk about marital agreements and just really clarify for people what they are. People are like, is that a prenup, a post-nup? What the heck is happening here? So can we start by saying, what is a marital agreement?
Right. So Tracy, when most people, know prenups, they might think of Kanye West where he sings Holly, we got prenup. And we hear that term thrown around all the time. And really a prenup, a post-nup, a marital agreement, they are contracts, and they are done before a divorce is really kind of moving forward. The agreement that is reached in a divorce, at least in Colorado and most other states have, it's called a separation agreement. So that's different. But really, it's an agreement between a husband and a wife, or a wife and a wife, or husband and a husband these days. But it really spells out in terms of what is going to happen in the event of a divorce, as well as what happens if someone dies. And really, they're kind of special contracts because they have these additional obligations. So disclosure, which we'll get into, and some of the other things. But it would be, Tracy, you and I, if we had a contract on this podcast of I'm going to appear on your podcast, that's it's a written agreement. It can be oral. It can be, reduced to writing. But really these marital agreements or premarital agreements, it's an agreement that has kind of some plus factors or some additional requirements in the event of divorce, really is what your listeners are going to be mostly focused on.
Okay, yeah. And I know that as we're talking about divorce on my podcast, more than anything, we're educating them both the for the pre, but also there's some people that get them like, gosh, right before I'll just say the spouse asks for a divorce, let's set some of this up, and they'll throw that in before they're even going in the divorce door, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And some people will come into my office or call up and they'll say, listen, we're having some marital issues. And if it's financial, then you could maybe spell out, hey, if one party is frustrated with the other spending, you could put the kind of responsibility on them, and we can split it up. And most of the time, all the time, these premarital agreements, it's going to really be about money. You can't have an agreement on what's going to happen to the kids in 5 years or 15 years and 10 years. Every state in the country is going to view that as unenforceable. You're also likewise not going to be able, when I say money, be able to kind of dictate how much child support is going to be. But we're talking about assets and debts, the forks, the knives, who's going to get the Honda and who's going to get the Rolls Royce. And that's really what it comes down to.
Right. And as you said, a lot of times the assets are what's here. Like you have no rights to, say, my trust, or you have no rights to, my 401k if something should happen. So it's generally about the assets. But as you said, property is an asset, but children are also sometimes put into this. Is that correct?
Yeah, and support or alimony, maintenance is what we call it here in Colorado, is you'll spell that out as well as attorney's fees related to a divorce. And really, Tracy, I think it's helpful for your listeners to understand how these agreements came about from a historical perspective. And if we look at the history, which I mean, I'm kind of a geek on this kind of thing. I find it really fascinating. But I mean, we can find agreements that between spouses as far back as ancient Egypt, 3,000 years ago. But really, when we're talking about the prenup that Kanye West is referencing, that's really starting in the 16th century of England, and it was originally for not second wives, but second marriages, and spelling out what the children were going to get, because the Lord in England, he wanted to make sure that the Johnny and Sally or Harry and Frederick, back then, that they were going to inherit the castle if they died when they remarried. And so it was really to protect children for second marriages. That morphed in the 60s and 70s in the United States into what happens in the event of a divorce. Previous to that, for kind of social and moral and other public policy reasons, agreements that dealt with divorce, they were not really favored by law, because the idea was that it was going to encourage divorce. But once we realized that divorce was just it was a reality in society, then the courts in Florida kind of led the way with in enforcing or recognizing the enforceability of a prenup that spelled out what happened in the event of divorce. And so we now are seeing a trend. Millennials, younger people, they have a trend of being more receptive to having a prenup, because their parents often went, 50-60%, depending on the statistics you're looking at, have of marriages are ending in divorce. So the millennials, they saw their parents go through a divorce. They just are, pragmatic when it comes to the reality that they could be getting a divorce. And so we have at least, observed that millennials and younger generations, they're more receptive to premarital agreements or marital agreements.
Yeah. Well, again, it's going with the tide, right? It's not like in history as it was. That is when the very rich kings and the oligarchs were protecting their assets, and then as it moved in, it was really the rich people. And now it's like, you know what? I got this little 401k. I'd like to have it protected. I'd like to keep it separate. All of those little details. I had a prenup. Now there's two factors here. It was given to me by my husband and his parents the day before my wedding, and I was requested to go and have it signed, and it was just a shenanigans. There was a line in there. Now, here's the thing that's going to tie into what I want to discuss. My in-laws had this made in New York, where we were going to get married the next day at their home, but we lived in Connecticut, so we took it to our Connecticut lawyer, and she crossed off a line that said, I give up my rights to alimony. She crossed it off. He sat there, he took it in, his copy was crossed off, and he walked into the other attorney who was going to review it for him. And they went, okay, yeah, that's not legal here in Connecticut. All right, no problem. And then we're getting a divorce in Colorado. And so what law applies? How do we know, like, again, can people protect themselves from that sort of thing happening?
Well, there's a couple of things that your issue or your story raises. The first, which I'll address, is the choice of law. So in a marital agreement, you can spell out whether Connecticut, New York, Colorado, Alaska, what law applies. And, another trend I referenced, kind of modern trends earlier, people are moving around all over the place. And so we've seen a lot of people relocating. I mean, Aspen, where I am, is just chock full of New Yorkers and Californians that have left the city, and they've come to, glitzy little place called Aspen. And so they bring with them, out of the numbers, there definitely going to be some people with premarital agreements, and that agreement could spell out what state and what law applies. And you and I were talking before the show, is that these laws on divorce vary across the country when it comes to states. So Connecticut has much different laws, as far as I understand it, compared to New York. And New York, I can tell you, I'm not barred in New York, but I've dealt with a number of cases where we're dealing with, does New York law apply or Colorado law apply? And it really is interesting. But you referenced what Connecticut law says on maintenance, and really, and your story raises these issues. And really, when you get into how you attack these agreements, because that's what, and when it really matters. And I mean, we saw just Dr. Dre play in the Super Bowl halftime show. He just went through a divorce, and he had a premarital agreement. Unfortunately, that premarital agreement came under attack, and he ended up paying $100 million, reportedly, even though he had a premarital agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's issues of, well, what are the circumstances under which these agreements, and you get into both substantive fairness, whether or not the agreement is fair on its face,
Mm-hmm.
versus procedural fairness. So, and I can explain that more if you like, but the procedural issue would be you getting provided a copy of this agreement a day before your wedding, whether or not you consulted with an attorney. So there's different avenues of which people frequently attack. I see them all the time, and it can really matter, because certainly I've seen agreements where the parties sign something, they didn't have that much money at the time, and then one person ends up making $50 million, and then the question is, well, what happens in that circumstance? Is that agreement enforceable?
Mm-hmm. Right. And that brings up the point of how I don't know, what's the word? How much chance do people have to actually fight these, because we're talking about Dr. Dre and we're talking about his $100 million, and none of the people listening to this, I can assure you, have $100 million that are like in that situation. So like, how does someone, I'll call it a person without $100 million, fight something like this?
Well, they're really fact specific. And Tracy, then the reality becomes, if there's nothing to fight over, then really what's the point? And what we do see though is agreements are challenged. And I mean, I'm holding up for people that can't see, there's a book, it's about an inch thick. It's about attacking and defending marital agreements. And it's a handbook on all the different scenarios across the country where people have attacked agreements. Generally speaking, if there is an attorney involved, it is really hard, but both people. There are a lot of circumstances in which one, the husband, the narcissistic husband, he or groom, he goes and gets his own lawyer and then just shoves an agreement right before they walk down the aisle and says, you sign this, and, purposefully shuts out the bride or wife from seeking legal advice. And, certainly there's a avenue there to attack it. But from a general principle, if both attorneys have lawyers, it's really hard for them to argue that it's unfair. I mean, they might have an attack against or a claim against their attorney for malpractice, but really they're highly fact specific. And I can give you a couple examples to show you what really matters. And again, it also depends on the state in which people are living. In some states, they have to jump through a bunch of hoops. California, Barry Bonds, the disgraced, baseball player, he, was the subject of a case that went up to the California Supreme Court, and it was because he was in Las Vegas. He had, some woman there that I think it may have been a shotgun wedding, but he had her sign an agreement, and then they ended up kind of litigating it and fighting over it. I mean, the stories are really interesting when you hear about, Dr. Dre, or even, I mentioned Kim or Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. I mean, their wedding apparently was held up because of negotiations over an agreement. Now that we're kind of seeing all this stuff on social media and in the news about, Kanye West just, losing his marbles, it begs the question of, was he of sound mind when he signed an agreement? I mean, there's so many different ways that you can attack it, but really people need to be aware that an agreement that they may have thought was enforceable may not be so bulletproof after all.
Right. And that's exactly what happened in our case. While the line had been crossed off, the part that was bad was that neither lawyer initialed that we crossed it off. So then they pretended that they didn't have a copy, which I know was in his safe, but said, oh, she crossed it off. It never appeared there, right? So we had to pull in that original lawyer that 10 years before had actually crossed it off. Thankfully, she was a friend and knew me, so she actually did remember it. She's like, oh, I remember. And then we sent him in the other room, so we had witnesses, but the rest of it was upheld. They protected what they wanted to protect. So again, part I felt like I won, and part, and that was only because we had to battle over that stupid little cross off. And and yet I would promised it in the beginning. So there's so many little nuances that can happen with people. Is it fair to say that disputing a marital agreement is going to be costly for people?
Yes, but it's a matter of what is the return on their investment, and they should have, at a minimum, if there's an agreement, and there's something at least worth fighting over. So, there's some amount of money, then they should certainly seek an attorney, and most attorneys are going to ask a series of questions, and really they're going to get into the procedure first and foremost. So you're going to look at all agreements. They need to be in writing.
Mhm.
There was actually a couple cases here in Colorado recently that dealt with whether or not there was an oral agreement, but almost universally, the agreement needs to be in writing. It needs to be voluntary. And when you talk about voluntariness, Tracy, that's when you get into the timing. Like, was this agreement provided to you the day of your wedding versus a month ahead of time?
Right.
And the party, who's going to challenge it and say, "Oh, I was under duress," then I was provided this, and I was told that if I didn't sign this, then we wouldn't get married. And I understand that. I mean, listen, like my wife and I got married in Mexico. We had a lot of people coming in. There's a lot of pressure and societal expectation, especially post-COVID,
Mhm.
when a lot of weddings have been delayed because they didn't want to go forward with a COVID wedding,
Mhm.
and they've got a lot riding on it. And but the courts have universally across the country said, well, you didn't have to get married, so you didn't have to walk down that aisle.
Mhm.
And just because they said you need to sign this in order for us to get married, then they've said that that really isn't enough to raise the duress issue. Now, having a gun held to your head or something like that. And I don't know the ins and outs of the Dr. Dre marital agreement or premarital agreement, but that's what she didn't say that she was necessarily held at gunpoint. Although she did say that there was a circumstance apparently during their wedding where he did pull out a gun, but she's claimed that she was under duress. But you're really getting into the procedure of that agreement, and there's going to be disclosure, so you need to know what you're giving up. And I have seen the initials, Tracy, you referenced earlier. I had a case in which the parties didn't initial the financial disclosure. So it was debatable as to whether or not my client even signed it. And there was some other funny business. Ultimately, she ended up walking away with $7 million when she was supposed to get effectively zero. So those initials, they can really matter. And that's when a lawyer who knows what they're doing is really going to be able to add value. And it could be expensive, but if you're looking at $7 million or
Mhm.
a couple $100,000 difference, then it might be worth it. And then you get into the attorney I mentioned earlier. If there are attorneys on both sides representing them in the negotiations of a prenup or a marital agreement, then it's really hard to attack that agreement, because you can bring them in and claim or have them as a witness like you did, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an empowering thing for people to know about the initials. Like, who would have guessed, right? But I think the thing is, when you're being handed this is my question. When you're being handed this a week, a month, a day before your wedding, at that point, it should be more of a discussion than a here, sign this, but how do we both feel about this? And did you want to protect something too? And, I mean, it seems like that kind of back and forth should always be part of it. And if someone is handing you something, even if they've got all the assets, that lawyer that you hire is going to say, but let's protect you as much as, like, that's giving that time gives you the freedom to look at it in a much more clearer way and make sure that you are protected.
I couldn't agree more, Tracy. And our clients, what we advise them when they're negotiating a premarital agreement on either end is, you better be prepared to walk away from this. And but on the flip side, for the person that has the money, it's, is this fair? And if there's a negotiation, really what we're looking for is if there's a negotiation, an agreement that is, and this is where you get into the substantive aspects of the agreement.
Mhm.
Does the person just get tossed out onto the street with nothing except for the clothes on their back? The states aren't really going to want that person as a ward of the state where they're destitute and they're relying on welfare. So most states will have an exception either on the support component. And I referenced earlier child support. I mean, you can't determine what child support is going to be. It's unenforceable. But Alimony, the states kind of vary, but really there's usually some sort of release valve where if the agreement is so fundamentally unfair, whether it be on property
Mhm.
or on support. And here in Colorado, we really look at support. So even though someone waives alimony or waives support, kind of your situation, that the court is going to say, they're going to look at the agreement at the time of the divorce and determine whether or not that's fair. And the term of art here in Colorado is unconscionability, which is a mouthful. But really, what we're looking at is an agreement that if it gives the husband everything, then the court's going to say, listen, you should pay her alimony, even though the agreement says otherwise and says that she waives it. But if you have an agreement that says, listen, you get $100,000 per year of our marriage, which is a frequent, a milestone, and it kind of rewards someone for if they might give up their career. And certainly you can draft these sorts of agreements and say, listen, like if we have kids and you give up your career, I'm going to pay you a particular amount, a percentage of my estate, whatever the case may be. But I've certainly seen scenarios where someone's going to get $1 million. I mean, Tracy, I have seen agreements where the person gets more under a marital agreement than they would have otherwise in a normal divorce absent agreement. It's fascinating. But really, when you have that negotiated fair agreement, the courts are going to look at it and say, listen, I'm gonna uphold it. At some point, they were willing to accept this. They signed it,
Mhm.
and we're gonna uphold it. I mean, courts, they normally deal with contracts, and they
Mhm.
want to have stability and the predictability, and they're not going to second guess unless they have to, and they do have the power to look over people's shoulders and say, no, that this agreement just stinks,
Mhm.
and we don't like it.
Right, right. That this is so important. I'm so glad and thankful that you are here. Is there anything that we're missing that we think people should know? Is there something about defending them, or is there a procedure? Don't do it, do it, do it. Where should they be?
People ask me, should everyone have a premarital agreement? I think it really depends on the facts and circumstances and your relationship. I can, certainly in second marriages, when there's other children involved, because generally speaking, when you get married and then you die, the default is that the assets, and it kind of depends on the state by state, but the assets are going to go to the wife. And if you are older and you've got children, then you might want to change how the default really operates.
Mhm.
But it's not, the agreements are not for everyone, but you're going to look at the predictability and have a discussion. And I think everyone should have a discussion about how they're going to really work their money, or handle their money during their marriage. But I mean, the law is really complex. There's circumstances in which, certainly I've seen it, and this came up in Dr. Dre's scenario, in which he, allegedly tore up the agreement. I've seen it where the people, they signed an agreement, it became kind of an issue in their marriage. So the guy drunkenly over a dinner party with various friends threw the agreement into the fire and said that, this is no longer there. I've had another circumstance where, husband tore up the agreement and put it in a Valentine's Day card for the wife and said, here's your Valentine's present. Our agreement is torn up. The legal issue is, are those are those enforceable, repudiation or revocation of an agreement? And I mean, it gets really complex. But if people have an agreement and they're looking at divorce, they should certainly seek legal counsel. I think that's, if someone is listening to this and that's the takeaway, it would be that. And if they are looking at getting married, they need to do their marital agreement right in the first place. And usually that means paying a lawyer to negotiate it in order for it to be enforceable down the line.
Right. Thank you. Now, my last thing, as you were talking, it just occurred to me, does having a marital agreement make a divorce easier? Sometimes, unless they dispute it, right?
Right. And I think, I mean, usually what happens when you have a disputed agreement is you'll have what's called a bifurcated process. So the court will determine whether or not the agreement is enforceable before really getting into the other issues, because it circumvents or makes the valuation and the disputes on those various issues they could be irrelevant because the agreement kind of spells out what happens.
Mhm.
But when you're defending, you previously mentioned, when you're defending an agreement, basically the name of the game is you open up the file on the original agreement. So you want to get into emails, you want to ask for your attorney's billing statements that negotiated the agreement so that you could show kind of a timeline, and talk about the drafts. All of those things you want to do in order to defend an agreement and show it was fair, it was negotiated, they had all the information. Look at these emails, look at this billing statement that shows kind of all of the negotiation that went on. And videos, we will take videos of people signing so that they can't say, well, he was holding a gun to my head. If you have a video of the signing, then you can say, look, she's he or she is maybe not happy, but they're not being forced, and you can show what they're signing and all of that. So those are just a few pointers. Obviously, I could talk for a lot longer, but I know
We've
your
got a whole
listeners
book
have
of
a
it, right?
limited bandwidth.
Absolutely. There's so much in here, and what you just said never occurred to me. So anyone who's watching this, like if you are setting up a prenup or premarital or any kind of marital and the process, keep that documentation, print out those emails, print out those drafts, save that documentation, because you may be married for 10 or 12 or 20 years. And if it's going to make a difference in its enforcement, have it on a little flash drive. Like there's nothing better than that. So protect
Yeah,
yourself.
Tracy, I've seen agreements kind of similar to what you apparently went through. Is I had a situation where no one could find the signed agreement. My client told me I signed it, but the other party, they couldn't find the signed agreement.
Mhm.
And I mean, they conducted themselves as if they had an agreement because it said that they would have separate bank accounts. But we were able to squeeze out more money, and it was to my client's advantage. So it really depends on who is involved and what you're if you want to have the agreement enforceable or not. Those things can really matter. But we see it all the time, and they make the news. We see it with celebrities, but these cases, unfortunately, they result in a lot of disputes because oftentimes it means that there's a lot of money involved. And do it right.
You just like, I'm like, oh my God, he just gave me another nugget. Keep your copies safe. Like if you are married to a narcissist, you might not know it when you married him, or her, but keep that document safe. Just as my in-laws and ex said, I don't have a copy. She made it up, right? Well, I did have the copy. So keep your copy no matter where you are in the process. Again, they could, if it's in your mutual safe, they could certainly take it out and then like, I don't know, it was always there. And now you've got no proof and evidence to defend yourself.
Well, and Tracy, you referenced, I mean, we're talking in a digital age, so a lot of these agreements are being stored Dropbox or in digital format. And, who's to say that a narcissist like your husband is going to just change the agreement and then just attach your signature page. So, you're getting into metadata, you're getting into, cybersecurity, those kinds of issues. And I mean, that happens because you may not remember striking out that provision on alimony or maintenance. And then all of a sudden that could really, really matter.
Absolutely. This has been so helpful. Thank you so much, Ryan. Can you tell everyone once again, we're going to have your name across the bottom with your website, but how can they reach you? What's the best way to reach you?
Best way is to email me, or give me a call. Our website is kalamaya.law. There's now .com. Some people are kalamayalaw.com, but it's just Kalamaya, and they can just think of calamari. That's what like I said, I was a baseball player. My first judge, she used to call me Mr. Calamari, and my colleague hit me in the ribs and said, she's calling you Mr. Calamari. And I just am like a dog. I come to anything because I've had my name mispronounced on the PA system so many different times. But people often remember that. But it's Ryan Kalamaya, KALAMAYA.law, and they can find information about our podcast, Divorce at Altitude, and helpful resources on. We've had several podcast episodes about premarital agreements, attacking agreements, and other topics, like having you, Tracy, on, divorcing a narcissist.
So yeah, definitely everybody hook up in. We're going to have all that show notes down below. So follow him. You'll get his website there, get some more information. And podcasts are the best information. It's education that you might need along the way. So thank you so much for being with us today, Ryan.
Thank you. And thank you for what you're doing for your listeners, Tracy. I think is really valuable, the information that you are putting out there. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope you guys got something out of that. He's a wealth of information. I swear we could have talked for hours in our pre-call. We were like two geeky divorce fact things of, he's got the big book that shows us all the research and history behind all of this. So again, another piece, a cog in the wheel of the divorce puzzle and the marriage and the prenup, post-nup, all of that stuff. So I hope you got some answers here today. I want to remind you of my book, which is Divorcing You're a Narcissist. You can't make this shit up. It is a best-selling book that is taking the world by storm, and it's so exciting to see. So if you're going through a divorce, please pick it up. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, Audible, you can find it anywhere. And for people who are out of the United States that are having difficulty getting it, a Kindle or an Audible might help you as well. So this is Tracy Malone. Thank you so much for watching, and join me again for another episode in my series on divorce. Thank you so much.